They looked at me like I crawled from under a bridge. No one suspected that under my plain jacket and worn sneakers sat the kind of bank account that could buy their houses twice over. That's the thing about blending in. People mistake modesty for failure and restraint for weakness. I made myself small on purpose. I drove the older car, paid in cash when I could, and clipped grocery coupons with quiet pride. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to see how people treated someone when they thought there was nothing to gain. It didn't take long to learn the answer. Cruelty is cheap when they believe you are too. The children in our family seized every chance to mock me. "Why don't you ask for a raise at the soup kitchen?" They'd snicker as I walked in wearing the same neutral sweaters. Another time, one of them waved a handful of designer shopping bags in my face and said, "You'd never understand this kind of lifestyle." They didn't know that I could have bought the entire store in cash and still had millions left to spare. The sting wasn't the insults themselves. It was their certainty. That smug belief that because I chose the quiet path, I was stuck on it. They never thought to wonder why I never borrowed money, never complained about bills, never scrambled like the relatives they compared me to. They never saw the investment statements I kept neatly filed away, showing balances so large they barely fit across the page. And I said nothing. That was my weapon even then. When people call you nothing, silence unsettles them more than protest. But sitting quietly can bruise the ribs from the inside out. I drive home after family dinners feeling both invisible and furious, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles blanched. Then versus now. Back then their smirks held power, now even remembering them makes me laugh. What they said was, "You're poor, pitiful, and small." What I did was let them record their own behavior with every cutting word. Every community has its hierarchy, and ours was no different. They were the self-declared royalty, strutting around as if a brand logo stitched into a sleeve was proof of superiority. And I was the experiment they couldn't resist tormenting. But experiments have results, and every cruel joke carved another line of resolve inside me. I understood something they didn't. Silence isn't surrender. It's storage. Each laugh at my shoes, each wrinkle of disgust at my hand-me-down coat, those moments became fuel tucked neatly away, waiting for the right match to strike. That's why my calm face should have worried them. They should have noticed how little it rattled me when they pointed out my poverty. They should have realized that someone who truly had nothing might scream, might beg, might lash out, but someone who has everything can afford to bide their time. That was their blind spot, and as they mocked the mask, they never stopped to imagine what I might be hiding beneath it. And one day they'd regret that blindness. I can still hear the screech of the plastic divider sliding across the grocery store conveyor belt. It was a Saturday afternoon, the place packed with neighbors stocking up for the week. I had my usual basket, bread, milk, rice, a few vegetables, all chosen with the deliberate modesty I wore like armor. Behind me stood my niece and her friends, chattering loudly about some party. They were dressed like they had sponsorship deals with fashion houses, snapping photos of themselves against the neon-lit end-cap displays. I kept my head down, pretending to be invisible, but I could feel the heat of their eyes on the back of my faded jacket. When I reached into my pocketbook and pulled out a handful of neatly folded bills, the laughter began. "Cash, who even uses cash anymore?" one of them snorted. "She probably doesn't even have a debit card, that's so sad." Another chimed in, "Hey, maybe she's saving those coins for rent." Their voices carried across the checkout lanes and people turned. The cashier froze, not sure whether to laugh with them or continue scanning my items. I held the bills tightly, smoothing them against the counter to stop my hands from shaking. It wasn't the first time they had mocked me, but this time stung in a different way. This time, strangers bore witness. Their giggles ricocheted off the shelves of cereal boxes and candy bars, slicing right into the fragile part of me that still remembered working double shifts to get through school. Then versus now, I stood there like a statue, swallowing every word, pretending their laughter slid off my skin. Inside, though, every syllable landed like a strike. I remembered the decades of 18-hour days, the careful investments, the quiet discipline that turned my first small paycheck into the empire no one could see. Yet here I was, painted into their story as a beggar at a checkout lane. What they said was, "You're pathetic, standing there with your crumpled bills." What I did was breathe in slowly and let the humiliation pool inside me, not spilling a drop. The cashier bagged my groceries, her hands fumbling as though my embarrassment might rub off on her. I thanked her softly, like always, and gathered my bags. Behind me, my niece whispered just loud enough, "Can you believe I'm related to that?" It was crafted to hurt, and it did. Public shame versus private power. That was my reality. Out in the open, it looked like they had crowned themselves victors, towering above me in their designer sneakers. But my power remained underground, like roots strengthened by storms. They saw weakness in my silence. They didn't see the account balances, the trust structures, the assets tucked away like jewels in a locked chest. Walking toward the sliding glass doors, I felt the eyes of strangers at my back, some pitying, others amused. No one knew that my silence in that moment wasn't surrender but storage again. I pushed my cart out into the sunlight, bags rustling, and realized something vital. Humiliation burns differently when it's witnessed. It brands you. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I gripped the steering wheel and forced myself to replay their words over and over again, pressing them into memory like fingerprints on wet clay. Strangely, I found comfort in cataloging the moment, as if the precision of their cruelty provided me clarity. The world loves symbols, and that day I became one in their minds, the relative who never made it, the proof that frugality was synonymous with failure. But symbols can change meaning. They can be reforged. The loneliness clawed at me hardest as I carried the grocery bags into my quiet kitchen. No one was there to see the tears prick at the corners of my eyes, no one to note the sharp ache of betrayal in the people who should have been my defenders. Family is supposed to stand by you to correct the slander of outsiders. Instead, my family was the slander. Then versus now, my silence once might have been mistaken for weakness, but leaving that store, I understood it differently. What they called poor was, in fact, rich discipline. What they ridiculed as poverty was freedom from their shallow chains. I poured myself a glass of water, slid the grocery bags across the counter, and looked at the neat stack of receipts I always filed away, tiny records of a life lived modestly by choice. And in that simple act of tidying them, I felt the shift. That day at the checkout lane was the last time I let their laughter pass without consequence. If they wanted to make me a symbol, I'd rewrite the definition. If they wanted to label me poor, I'd show them what true poverty looked like, a poverty of respect, of love, of grace. And yet I smiled, because I knew this wasn't the end, it was a beginning. That was the day I decided I'd stop protecting their failings. People see the present. Almost no one bothers to ask about the past. If they ever had, maybe they'd have understood why I still fold each grocery receipt, why I reuse jars, why my shoes last until the seams hum. They would have seen that my poverty wasn't poverty at all. It was proof of endurance, discipline, and sacrifice stitched into every corner of my life. I remember the nights that bled into mornings, staring at a computer screen, my eyes burning while the world was fast asleep. I was younger then, hustling in silence, clocking in extra shifts and taking freelance jobs no one else wanted. There were weekends when the sun rose and set, and I barely noticed because I was too deep in spreadsheets and proposals. I traded parties for paychecks, indulgences for investments. Some people build scrapbooks of memories. I was building a balance sheet that would eventually hold my entire freedom. But no one cheers for you when you're invisible. They only laugh when you show up years later with the faded jacket and the old sedan. They think you made nothing of yourself, when in reality that coat was bought with cash I didn't owe interest on, and that car was fully mine, all while my brokerage accounts grew like vines. Contrast has a cruel way of making itself obvious. While I was bringing a packed lunch to work every day, peanut butter sandwiches in recycled bags, my relatives were throwing money at takeout meals, designer shoes, and vacations they couldn't afford. Month after month, their social media glowed with their so-called success. Underneath, their credit lines strained like fraying thread. Meanwhile, my modest wage slips quietly piled into certificates of deposit, index funds, and eventually, small but strategic real estate. I think back to my first rental property. It wasn't pretty. The walls were scuffed and the plumbing sputtered like an old man trying to run, but I saw it differently, not as a house but as leverage. Each month when the tenant's rent arrived, I set it aside rather than spending it. Little by little, that first property birthed another. Compound interest, steady reinvestment, the stubborn restraint to deny myself luxuries until my portfolio could pay for them 10 times over, that's what built the fortune they now mocked without knowing. What they saw as ragged shoes were actually trophies, each scuff and stain proof that I had chosen savings over splurges. What they thought was desperation was my version of discipline. The irony is sharp. They pitied me for living below my means while I pitied them for living above theirs. It wasn't just about money. It was about respect for the long game, the patience to let seeds sprout instead of eating them straight from the bag. Every time I held back from buying a new gadget, every time I said no to some fleeting indulgence, I was stacking bricks in a wall that could never be knocked down. I can still feel the ache of those years. The frustration of eating beans and rice while watching cousins arrive at gatherings in flashy cars. The small pang when coworkers talked about their nights out, and I nodded politely, knowing I'd spent mine drafting budgets under a single lamp. The loneliness of not explaining it to anyone because nobody likes to hear you traded fun for planning. But I also remember the thrill of watching numbers climb, pennies turning into dollars, dollars into tens of thousands, tens into millions. While they bragged about discounts on handbags, I grinned quietly at my quarterly statements, watching the magic of compounding do its work. Still, I kept it hidden. Pride in numbers is different from pride in labels. Mine was invisible but indestructible. And yet the greatest insult is that no one saw it. No one saw that the reason I reused aluminum foil wasn't that I lacked money, but that my willpower had already earned me freedom most people never taste. No one asked, they assumed. That's the fuel that burned in me on the day at the grocery store. Because when my niece mocked my handful of cash, she wasn't just ridiculing bills, she was ridiculing decades of discipline she couldn't comprehend. Then versus now, I used to think my humility kept me safe, tucked away from envy or suspicion. Now I see it shielded them from truth. What they said was, you'll never have what we have. What I did was build something far greater, something they couldn't buy with all the credit in the world. Public shame versus private power. They called me a beggar while in reality I was the bank. They laughed at my coupons, not knowing those coupons stacked into rental income, dividend checks, and security none of them even dreamed about. The hard thing about sacrifice is that it's invisible while it's happening. All anyone sees is what you've given up, what you lose. They don't see the invisible seeds you're planting underground, until one day those seeds burst through the soil, undeniable, undeniable, undeniable. I stood in my quiet kitchen after that humiliation, looking at my neat stacks of carefully organized statements, and I felt the weight of those memories pressing back against their cruelty. My sacrifices had been real. My choices had been hard, but they weren't worthless. They were priceless. And if they thought I was worthless, I was about to teach them the value of worth. Pain can be fleeting, but record-keeping makes it permanent. Somewhere between the third mocking dinner and that humiliating scene at the grocery store, I began writing it all down, not in the way most people journal, with meandering sentences about emotions. No, mine was a ledger. Black ink against white pages, structured the way I'd once managed my accounts. Every insult had a date. Every sideways glance had a line. Every jab, every smirk, every time their laughter filled a room at my expense, logged, numbered, stored. I built it the way others build scrapbooks, photos of birthdays on one side, my records on the other. But unlike them, I wasn't preserving nostalgia. I was preserving evidence. On the surface, I was still the quiet, frugal relative. I nodded along when they poked fun at my shoes, hummed softly when they waved receipts from brand-name boutiques. But the moment I was alone, I'd slip into the sanctuary of my living room, take out a pen, and write. December 14th mocked my jacket as Salvation Army chic. March 2nd laughed at the idea of me owning property without a mortgage. If only they knew about duplex on Waverly Street. July 8th said I should just be grateful for leftovers at family barbecue. Each line added weight not to me but to them. Contrast is a funny thing. Outwardly they thought silence meant submission. Inwardly, I was building two parallel financial statements. One measured my financial discipline, the other their moral bankruptcy. Page after page of my ledger fell in line with the financial charts and graphs I kept just as meticulously. If you'd opened my desk drawer then, you would have seen two binders side by side. One filled with cruelty, one filled with compounded returns. Both were testaments to my patience. I remember how the numbers looked on April 10th, a date burned into my mind. That was the exact day they laughed as I paid with coins at the coffee shop. I wrote it down, went home, and opened my laptop. My brokerage dashboard flashed $4.2 million in long-term index fund holdings. I added the insult to one notebook, updated the account balance in the other. That's when I realized the sick beauty of my system. Their contempt was growing at the same rate as my net worth. What they said was, "You're pathetic." What I did was match every insult with interest-bearing receipts. The investments themselves were not glamorous. I bought shares of Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund back in January 1992, reinvested every dividend, and never sold in panic. I bought Johnson & Johnson stock in 1994 at $48 a share. By the time they laughed at my thrift store dress in 2007, that stock had split twice and was paying dividends that quietly covered a month of groceries. They craved labels on their backs. I craved cash flow on paper. I recall buying my second rental townhouse in 2005 for $185,000, right as they teased me for driving the old Toyota. That same car became the down payment seed. Because I hadn't sunk money into a flashy upgrade, I had enough cash freed for closing costs. Now that townhouse alone covers property taxes on 2 others. So when they sneered again at the peeling paint along my driveway, I logged that too. 2005, May 21st. Your house looks like a poor man's castle. Income that year from rents, $46,000. Net worth crossing $2.1 million. Numbers don't lie, no matter how convincingly people laugh. At some point, the ledger became less about memory and more about blueprint. By filing their bad behavior so diligently, I began to realize that one day, those pages could have a purpose beyond comfort. They could map the arc of disrespect so that, when the moment was right, I could hold it in front of them like a mirror. That's the thing about ledgers, they balance. For every debit, there must be a credit. Their cruelty was the debit, my quiet resilience, that was the compounding interest stacking on the credit side. I'd sit at my desk at midnight sometimes, flipping between my accounts and my notebook, watching both grow heavier. Sometimes I'd even smile to myself. They thought they were aging me, beating me down, making me smaller. But with every entry, I only became sharper, more certain, more measured. Public shame versus private power, it didn't get any clearer than that. Everyone saw the smirks and snickers, yet nobody saw the 20,000 shares of a boring blue-chip stock sitting in my portfolio, quietly spitting back dividends that kept my lights on forever. Everyone remembered my patched coat. No one remembered the escrow checks on rental properties I never bragged about. It's a strange thing, humiliation can make you desperate. But if you can stand very still, it can also make you deliberate. I chose deliberate. By the time I entered my 50s, their comments rolled like clockwork, weary repetitions of the same tired jokes. Broke, beggar, nobody. My pen kept recording them as if each insult was just another deposit. And beside them, the purity of digits on account statements, my hidden empire blooming larger with every cycle. Then versus now, then I'd grit my teeth while they mocked. Now I realized I was calibrating a form of justice so exact it would stun them. What they said was cruel. What I did was calculate. The ledger gave me something unexpected, peace. Not because I enjoyed reliving their cruelty, but because it converted something emotional into something measurable. Insults became entries. Humiliation became line items. Suddenly, they weren't hurts, they were data. And with data, there's always a way to balance the equation. It almost felt unfair, as if I was punching above my weight using only a pen. But revenge doesn't rush. Revenge accrues just like compounded returns. And when the day comes to present the final balance, it won't be me screaming at them. It won't be me begging for acknowledgement. It will be me calmly showing them the books and letting silence do the talking, the same silence they mistook for weakness years before. Because I finally understood the truth, I didn't need to shout to win, I just needed to keep writing. I realized my silence was my sharpest weapon. It wasn't enough anymore to simply record their cruelty. A ledger tells the story of the past, but I wanted to know in my bones who they would prove themselves to be in the present. If they had even one shred of kindness hiding under their designer coats, I wanted to give them a chance to show it. In my way, I offered them a test. The first was small. One Saturday, I invited my nephew to join me for lunch. Nothing fancy, a humble diner tucked beside a gas station on the edge of town. The kind of place with chipped mugs and pie slices handed out on paper plates. When the bill came, I set it gently between us, buying myself a moment of silence. He didn't even hesitate. He snorted, shoved it toward me and said, "Come on, you asked me out, you can cover it. Plus, you know I don't carry cash." I smiled, the ledger in my head clicked. Another line, another failing. The second test was even simpler. I asked my niece to help me shovel the driveway one winter. A small job, 10, maybe 15 minutes of effort at most. She wrinkled her nose, muttered something about her manicure, and drove away in her brand new car. Later that afternoon, I paid a local high school kid $50 to handle it instead. Funny thing, he smiled, thanked me, and did the chore with a cheerful energy my own bloodline could never muster. Contrast where strangers gave warmth, kin gave disdain. If that wasn't telling, what was? I began sprinkling these opportunities deliberately, almost like laying breadcrumbs on a trail. A ride to the airport here. A hand carrying groceries there. A chance to share a modest home-cooked meal, an open door to stop by and talk after a hard week. Not one bite, not one lift, not one genuine gesture ever came back my way. If anything, the failures became theatrical. Once I baked a simple casserole and invited them over for dinner. They laughed when they saw the chipped casserole dish. One actually said, "This looks like something you'd feed shelter dogs." I spooned serving after serving onto their plates, never letting the weight of my hand betray the crush in my chest. Then versus now. Back then, I still harbored hope, brittle but present, that one of them might surprise me, might prove blood could stand above the shallow game of appearances. Now I know hope itself was the cruelest indulgence I allowed myself. Each test was a controlled experiment, but the results were always the same: failure, not one shred of empathy, not a flicker of respect. Every refusal, every humiliation just stacked higher in my notebook and sharper in my resolve. The strange part, with each logged incident I grew less sad and more certain. Less the bruised relative and more the strategic observer. Detachment was its own form of power. They mistook my invitations for weakness. In reality, they were my measuring tape. What they said was, "We're too good for this." What I did was silently calculate how unworthy they truly were. The most unforgettable test came at a family dinner, an unremarkable chain restaurant, the kind with faux leather booths and menus laminated like glossy instruction manuals. I suggested the place. Predictably, they rolled their eyes. "Of course you pick here, you love cheap food," one muttered before ordering the most expensive entree they could find. I sipped water and let them preen across the table, flexing names of brands and vacations like jewelry strung on their tongues. I didn't flinch, I only waited. When the waiter delivered the bill, I let it sit in the center of the table untouched. Silence hovered. One by one their eyes flicked to me. My nephew cleared his throat, my niece smirked, and then came the chorus of giggles. "Oh please," she said. "Are you waiting for us to pick it up? You can't even buy decent shoes. Relax, we won't make you wash dishes to cover it." Their laughter tumbled into the restaurant, spilling into the air, drawing attention from tables nearby. There it was again, public shame versus private power, lining up exactly as I expected. They saw themselves as nobles tossing scraps from their feast. I sat stoic, letting their arrogance broadcast itself to the strangers in neighboring booths. I paid, of course. I laid down the cash, exact bills smoothed with steady hands, thanked the waiter as though nothing in the world was amiss. Outwardly, it was the picture of meek surrender. Inwardly, a bomb had gone off, steady, measured, irreversible. Coldness crept into my veins that night, not fiery rage. Fire burns too fast, smokes too brightly. Coldness, though coldness can last forever. I felt it settle in as we exited the restaurant, their laughter still buzzing, their mockery still clinging to the air like spilled perfume. That was when I knew the ledger wasn't enough. The test had proved it. The time for recording had passed. The time for drafting had come. Then versus now, before I was only cataloging. After that dinner I was planning. What they said was, "You're worthless, dependent, nothing." What I did was carry their words home like precious evidence, the final entries in a case file I was ready to prosecute in my own private court. I opened my binder that night, the familiar weight of the pages folding against my hands. On the left, years of cruel entries. On the right, financial statements so sturdy they gleamed with inevitability. For the first time, I saw how the two would merge, how the story I'd been logging would transform into the punishment they'd never forget. It no longer mattered if they respected me on their own. I would make them respect the truth. Their greed had spoken louder than I ever could. And when I flipped the page, I knew in my soul the next entry wouldn't just be a memory. It would be a strategy. Most battles are fought with fists or with raised voices. Mine would be fought with signatures, notarizations, and the slow, unshakable weight of paperwork. I had tested them, they had failed. I had recorded them, the file was complete. Now I began outlining the architecture of their undoing. It started not with rage, but with folders: green for trusts, blue for banking, red for property, yellow for potential contingencies. Each folder was another flank of the war they never knew they were walking into. Evenings that they spent gossiping and scrolling for sales online, I spent revisiting my estate planning. I studied fine print like a surgeon studying anatomy. Where would the scalpel fall? Which veins could be tied off without bleeding myself dry? I sat at my oak desk, lamp glowing, pen scratching. If they had studied me closely in those nights, they might have mistaken my concentration for loneliness. Only I knew it was strategy. The first maneuver was insurance. They had often joked about who would get the house when I was gone, smirking as though I were too poor to provide anything more than debt. I redirected life insurance benefits away from family entirely, naming charities and scholarship programs instead. A methodical strike. Where they expected handouts, they would find locks. Where they expected windfalls, they would find stones. Then came the trusts. I met with my attorney, a soft-spoken woman with sharp eyes who, unlike them, knew the full extent of my wealth because she had drafted the umbrella to protect it years earlier. We sat in her office with cups of tea, the scent of bergamot filling the room. I outlined precisely who would be excluded, who perhaps might be tested one last time, and how detailed the stipulations must be. She smiled once faintly. "You've thought all of this through," she said. I nodded. I'd been thinking for decades. My ledger of insults wasn't just a source of validation now, it was raw material. I would sprinkle phrases from it directly into trust stipulations. Imagine their faces when respectful communication determined access to principal distributions, or when the record of their public mockeries became fuel for conditions I alone chose. If they sneer at humility, let humility be the gatekeeper they can't pass. Next, inheritance adjustments. I wrote names once chosen out of tradition and struck them through with deliberate ink. They had no idea, of course. They were too busy bragging about weekend getaways and networking parties. They couldn't see the inheritance ladder they climbed in drunken conversation was already burning beneath them, match lit in my pen. Contrast makes clarity inevitable. While they mocked me over diner bills, I sat surrounded by documents ensuring they would one day beg for access to funds I had already promised elsewhere. While they sharpened their jokes, I sharpened clauses that would bind them tighter than they could imagine. Then versus now, once their jabs left me wounded. Now they became my tools. What they said was, "You'll never leave anything behind." What I did was reroute millions into causes that outlived me, leaving them to choke on a feast of nothing but their own entitlement. The plotting didn't stop there. I began slowly shifting account authorizations. One by one, their names vanished from emergency contacts and beneficiaries. They would never know until the day came. That was the exquisite joy of strategizing quietly. I got to watch them strut through life in ignorance while I adjusted every hinge of the future. I even rehearsed scenarios privately, asking myself, if they came to my door in crisis, how could I legally and financially prevent them from extracting unearned sympathy? I spoke with bankers about freezes and staggered releases of funds. There were systems for everything if you knew which levers to pull. Do you know how freeing it is to plan justice on paper? It feels like building a dam brick by brick, knowing the flood behind it grows taller each day, and knowing too that the release, when it comes, will sweep away everything fragile and false. Every insult logged in my notebook hummed louder as I placed another condition into legal structure. And each new clause, each new asset retitled, gave me the stillness of victory before the battle even began. While they toasted cocktails, laughing about poor aunt or broke uncle, I was moving property titles into LLCs. I was shaping bank accounts with payable on death instructions they couldn't reverse. I was taking everything they mocked me for and weaponizing it into their absence from my will. Did they notice the calm in my face when they teased me? Did they notice the faint smile as I chewed my simple dinners? They should have. It wasn't surrender, it was checkmate in motion. Public scorn versus private empire. Their insults skimmed across the surface. My plotting sank deep into roots they couldn't cut. Sometimes, to amuse myself, I'd reread parts of the insult ledger while drafting clauses. Soup kitchen once-a-year coat, they'd written about me. I wrote into the trust, any beneficiary who demeans another family member for financial standing forfeits rights. Just like that, their words snapped the very branches they thought they were climbing. It was surgical, precise, satisfying. One weekend, I overheard them debate how quickly they'd divide my junk house when I was gone. I sat quietly, lips closed. They did not know there were 3 houses, none of them in their reach. They talked loudly about stripping me like a farmer stripping corn. I meanwhile was sowing fields in soil they would never touch. There is something exquisite about becoming invisible to those who feel superior. They never realize invisibility works both ways. While they couldn't see my power, I could see their downfall. Then versus now then I prayed their tune would change. Now I orchestrated it myself. What they said was, we'll take what's left after you're gone. What I did was guarantee there'd be nothing left for them to take. The strategist in me had fully emerged. The victim was gone. The silence remained, but now instead of swallowing pain, it was shaping destiny. I sharpened my pen while they sharpened their insults. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as an inconvenience, a delay, a card that suddenly declines on a Tuesday night. And because they thought I was powerless, they never suspected my shadow in their misfortunes. That was the beauty of it, justice delivered so gently they questioned the universe before they questioned me. It started with the allowances. Small deposits I had set up long ago, vestiges of kindness I extended when they were younger, $200 here, $500 there, meant to help them cover odds and ends when they were starting their adult lives. Over the years, it became entitlement. They no longer said thank you. It shifted into statements like, she's supposed to give us this, as if I were the ATM built into their family tree. One Monday morning, I simply terminated the transfers. A few button clicks, the kind of action that doesn't even raise a pulse. Silence except in their bank app. The following week, my nephew's texts began rolling in. Hey, my rent's a little short this month, can you resend? I typed back one word no. His next message was a question mark, as if denial when it came from me was inconceivable. But I left him on read and returned to my breakfast with a smile. Then versus now, once I would have scrambled to apologize, maybe even doubled the gift to ease the sting. Now I savored his disbelief. What they said was, "You owe us." What I did was close the tap. The second ripple was more amusing. My niece, the one who mocked my casserole dish, had applied for a store credit card. She had bragged about it at family gatherings like it would crown her independence. What she didn't realize was that my attorney and I had quietly removed every trace of me as a reference and reorganized certain shared assets under LLCs. Where she thought she could casually list family property ownership as proof of financial backing, there was nothing in her name anymore. Rejected, she raged about it online. "Can you believe these people won't approve me?" she wrote to friends. No one commented with sympathy, only awkward emojis. I printed the screenshot, slipped it into my ledger, and moved on. Soon, more inconveniences unfolded. A debit card declining at brunch. A line of credit reduced overnight. Job applications they whispered about mysteriously falling through when background checks revealed inconsistent financial histories. Of course, I wasn't sabotaging their work, they were doing that themselves. But stripped of the cushion I had quietly provided for years, their failures now landed without a net. Every stumble scraped skin. Can you imagine, for them to say aloud, "I can't pay my bills because she stopped carrying me"? It would shatter their carefully constructed lies of superiority. Pride wrapped them in chains I didn't even have to lock. Then versus now, for decades they demanded loudly and I complied softly. Now they screamed inwardly, but I answered only with stillness. Publicly they sneered, privately they begged. The allowance I cut was pennies compared to what I actually held. But to them, the loss felt seismic. Their budgets, so carelessly inflated, had no slack. They needed every drip. Pull one drip, the entire pipe rattles. That was the quiet symphony I composed, deprivation not of survival but of comfort. And every time they stumbled, I grew colder, calmer, firmer. My ledger of insults had transmuted into a chessboard of consequences. Check by check, piece by piece. Not captured with noise, but removed with elegance. One Sunday, I found myself driving past the mall. Out front, my niece was arguing with a store clerk, her tone shrill, her gestures wide. I didn't stop, but I knew her card had failed again. I caught one sentence as I rolled down the window at the light. "This card worked last week, I don't understand." I nearly laughed there in the car, because life finally was teaching her something I could never have said out loud. Entitlement has an expiration date. They were unraveling visibly now. Conversations at family dinners had shifted. "I can't believe the bank is messing with me," one grumbled. "Things keep dropping me, even friends don't answer when I ask for help anymore." Of course they didn't. People scatter when greed consumes you. Everyone could smell their desperation now. Everyone except perhaps the ones who had once called me desperate. I steepled my fingers, listening, adding silent entries in my mind. Rejected. Denied, declined, declawed. And here's the part that still thrills me. They never thought of me, not once. They blamed banks, they blamed bad friends, they blamed random bad luck. My invisibility was my disguise. My silence was my sharpest sword. The satisfaction wasn't in watching them suffer. It was in knowing they finally felt powerless in the very way they tried to make me feel for years. That irony, that symmetry, it was poetry only I appreciated in full. Day by day, the knock grew closer. I could hear it in their questions, sharp with hidden fear. And I knew eventually, inevitably, embarrassment would be swallowed, pride would bend. Silence had been my shield, now it was my lure. They finally came knocking at my door. The soufflé plates had been cleared, the candles replaced with fresh flames, and my family sat opposite me in stiff, forced stillness. For the first time in memory, their mouths, those weapons that had cut me 1,000 invisible ways, were quiet. Silent not out of respect, but because something in their bones had finally shifted. They sensed the balance of power had moved. It was time to confirm it. "Do you know," I began softly, almost conversationally, "how much $40 million looks like when it's disguised in pennies, beans, and hand-me-down coats?" They blinked, one coughed awkwardly. My nephew smirked nervously as if I had told a joke, but my voice didn't waver. "You see, when you mocked me for bringing coupons to the grocery store, I had already invested in a broad market index fund. January 1992. I remember the date because it was the same week you sneered at my second-hand kitchen table. $10,000 to buy into patience. Today, that same purchase alone is worth nearly $500,000. Their laughter didn't return, stillness deepened. "When you told me my Toyota was pathetic, 1994, I was signing papers on my first Johnson & Johnson shares at $48 apiece. I held them. Through recessions, through scares, through years of listening to you ridicule my wardrobe. Today, with splits and dividend reinvestment, I own more than 20,000 shares. The annual dividends alone could buy out this entire restaurant's wine cellar twice over. I paused, letting the air thicken. Across the table, they shifted uncomfortably in their elegant borrowed clothes. Do you recall the peeling paint on my driveway you mocked in 2005? That same year, while you were taking photos of borrowed handbags, I bought a rental townhouse for $185,000. Cash. That property pays me $3,000 every month, and it did so while you were snickering at my used coat. I bought two more just like it. Today, they're all worth more than triple. The words weren't bitter, I poured them gently like water into an empty glass. Calm, controlled. Fortune doesn't live in branding, I continued. It lives in choices. Every smirk you gave me was another decision that left me free to save, to invest, to build. You traded paychecks for handbags, I traded patience for freedom. And freedom pays better than handbags ever will. Their eyes darted sideways. I could see the memories colliding in their heads, my simple sandwiches, my old coats, my absence from flashy vacations. All the pieces snapping together, reframed in cruel relief. Everything they had mocked was evidence of wealth they hadn't even known to envy. Then versus now. Back then they thought I wasn't worthy of respect. Now they sat swallowing hard, realizing they weren't worthy of access. You know what else? I added, raising my voice just slightly as the staff poured more wine. This dinner won't even register in my accounts, not a dent, because my net worth isn't fragile. It isn't credit cards waiting to be declined. It isn't borrowed cars or show-off jewelry. It's an empire you trained yourselves never to see. One by one, I spelled it out. The properties, the diversified portfolios, the trust structures sitting quietly under corporate shells ensuring longevity, bank accounts stacked like walls fortified with decades of patience. And then I leaned forward, letting the dagger twist. $40 million. I enunciated slowly, watching their mouths part slightly, disbelief painted in wide strokes across their faces. Contrast couldn't be sharper. Once they laughed at buying me dinner. Now I could have bought the building around us without blinking. They sat pale under the chandelier's warm light. My niece's hands trembled near her glass, though she tried to steady it. My nephew's bravado had leaked from his posture, shoulders hunched as if waiting for a teacher's scolding. I wasn't finished. I also built something else, I continued, my voice quieting to a level where they had to lean in. Not just for me. You mocked me for spending nights alone instead of partying. Those nights turned into philanthropic work. Scholarships now exist in my name, 5 of them to be exact, sending other people's children to college debt-free. A charitable trust supports food banks across 3 counties. So while you made a sport of stripping me down in public, actual families have been lifted up in private. Without knowing it, you mocked the very hands that fed strangers. That landed hardest. Their shallow cruelty now reframed as grotesque beyond imagination. They had sneered at beggar meals, without knowing those same meals funded food for thousands. Then versus now, once they shaped me into the family clown. Now they sat exposed as hollow jesters in the theater of my accomplishment. What they said was, you'll never be anything. What I did was become more than they could even define. Silence fell heavy against the walls. Even the polished forks, the crystal chandeliers seemed to bow into it. I released a breath, felt the steel unclench at last inside me. Liberation isn't loud, it's dignified. And that was when the strangest feeling flooded me, not fury, not victory, relief. For years I was made small. Tonight I finally expanded, not to humiliate them, but to reclaim myself in front of them. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't need to. Numbers raised it for me. The waiter refilled my glass as though I were royalty, murmuring, "Another poor madam." The way he said it, softly deferential, only deepened their realization. They weren't sitting across from a beggar. They were sitting across from the head of an empire. You called me worthless, I said finally. You called me poor. That word beggar lived on your tongues like candy, but I wasn't begging for money. I was begging all along for just a hint of respect. And you failed, again and again. So tonight you learn the hard way that respect carries a price. I set my napkin gently atop the tablecloth, its folds crisp, precise. Then I looked at them one more time, catching each pair of eyes. By now, every ounce of arrogance had been replaced with a heavy, choking silence. And then I allowed the pause. A long pause, the kind an audience remembers most in a performance. I let it hang, twisting, until they couldn't bear it, until they fidgeted in seats and rubbed clammy palms against silverware. And when I spoke again, it was with the softness of a final blade against skin. And then I told them the part that really broke them. The silence at that dinner table was already suffocating, but the next words I spoke tied the knot around their throats. "You've been wondering, no doubt," I said evenly, "what will happen to all of this, to me, to everything I've built once I'm gone." Their eyes lit fast with a greedy reflex they could not hide. Like Pavlov's dogs, the mere mention of inheritance had them salivating. It was almost impressive, their arrogance bold enough to shine even through humiliation. For decades, they had treated my supposed poverty as proof they could write me off. But behind the laughter, I had overheard the occasional whisper between them, "Even if she looks poor, she must leave something behind. We'll take it when she dies." The joke was that my thrift would be their windfall. Now they would learn otherwise. "I did have a will once," I continued, "a typical one drawn up years ago, but I've rewritten it quite thoroughly." Nervous shifting at the table, palms pressed flat, eyes narrowed in sudden suspicion. "My estate, the properties, the stock portfolios, the accounts you've never seen will never fall into ungrateful hands. Instead, I've woven humility into it. If you wish to inherit, you must prove yourselves changed." Gasps like birds startled from branches, my niece's face twisted. "What does that even mean?" "It means," I said calmly, lifting my glass, "that money will no longer reward cruelty. The trust requires consistent respect, civility, and service to others. Fail those conditions, and whatever access you thought you had dissolves like sugar in water." Their disbelief floated across the table, not just shock at the conditions, but horror at the realization that their entire performance of superiority had been documented, weighed, and used as judgment. I continued, firm but not unkind. "Assets are also being redirected. Scholarships, philanthropy, food banks, medical research. My life's work is not to inflate egos but to plant seeds. You won't inherit my empire by default. You'll inherit nothing until you prove you understand the value of something beyond yourself." Then versus now, once they assumed my silence meant surrender. Now that same silence had drafted their conditions, their cages, their greatest loss. Once they thought inheritance was theirs by blood. Now they learned blood was meaningless without decency. Outrage flickered across their features. My nephew hissed, "You can't do this." I allowed myself the softest smile. "I already did. Paperwork moves quieter than laughter, but it cuts deeper. Every dotted line has been signed, every clause notarized. You'll learn soon enough." For years they had called me a beggar, but tonight they saw me for what I truly had become, the gatekeeper of their futures, the author of their consequences. And here's the part no one expected, not even me. Saying it out loud didn't inflame me. It freed me. I felt lighter, as though every insult pressed onto me had blown away like ash. Revenge hadn't consumed me, it had transformed into resolve. My legacy now lived not in bruises from their words, but in the scholarships, the charities, the lives touched by the patients they scorned but could not destroy. What they said was, "You'll end as nothing." What I did was ensure I would endure as everything they could never touch. I dabbed my lips with the linen napkin, set it gently on the table, and rose. Chandeliers shimmered, catching gold in the crystal glass as if the room itself acknowledged the finality. "You wanted my poverty," I said quietly. "Instead, you'll live with your own poverty of kindness, poverty of respect. That is the true inheritance you've earned." I walked toward the door with unhurried steps, feeling the weight of their stares burning against my back. But it no longer mattered. The balance was struck. My silence had been sharpened into justice, my humility reforged into dignity, my sacrifices translated into freedom. For the first time in decades, I was no longer the beggar in their story. I was the author of my own. And I left that dinner hall knowing one immutable truth. I was financially untouchable. Emotionally, gloriously, I was free.